Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Knowledge Thirsty Thursdays at SafeLink Alberta. My name is Karen. I am the education manager. I work in Calgary, and I'm going to be joined today by my co-facilitator, Kevin. Kevin, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Hi, thanks. I'm Kevin Day. I'm the Research and Community Engagement Specialist at SafeLink in Medicine Hat. And for those of you who do know me, I don't have glasses on right now because I broke them, because it can be, and so now I am not reading so well. So anyway, I'm looking forward to doing this. So.
Thank you, Kevin. And we are also joined today by our two guest speaker panelists, Kim and Sarah, who you'll see their videos up right now. Thank you both so much for joining us. We will give more in-depth introductions for these two fantastic guest speakers in a bit. So our plan for the day is to talk about the case for decriminalization, and we are going to lay a foundation for why decriminalization is a great legislation model for Canada to move towards. And then we are going to do an open Q&A with Kim and Sarah to talk about that more in a bit of depth. This is a webinar. It is being recorded, so if you have questions, we just encourage you to pop them into the chat box and we will be able to respond to them as they come in. We'll probably wait until the end of each slide to check in for questions, but we can absolutely answer them as we go if things come up for folks. All right. So before I move too much further into the training, I do want to acknowledge the land that I'm speaking from today. So I am in Calgary, Alberta, which is the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi, including the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, as well as the Tsuut'ina, the Yai, Nakota, and everyone who makes their home in the Southern Alberta region of Treaty 7, now known as Treaty 7. Southern Alberta is also home to Métis Nation Region 3. It is also always an honor for me to do a land acknowledgement as I stand in gratitude, in humility, and respect for the traditional people of this land and this territories, as well as for the knowledge that they have shared with me along my own decolonization journey as a settler in this land. And my goal is to continue to move forward to work towards incorporating their knowledge to be a good steward of this area and to work towards decolonization of my own journey and sharing those with other folks. So I stand in gratitude around that. So we're going to do a chat bomb box this morning. So this is a quick, do not hit start until I say go, but into the chat, just putting in your name, who you work for, and what you hope to learn today. No one else will be able to see it but me and Kevin and our two panelists, but that just lets us know who's on the call. We love to know who's attending our trainings, who's here, what you're hoping to get out of this next hour. So I'll give you all a moment to pop that into the chat box while I go through a smidge more of housekeeping. If you didn't catch our intro slides right at the beginning, we are SafeLink Alberta. We've been serving the community for over 40 years, working to reduce the harms associated with sexual activity and substance use. A little bit of housekeeping again.
Karen,
yeah.
Sorry, it was just, I was just told that the chat is disabled right now. I don't know what that means.
The chat is disabled. Is there a Q&A option? Somebody let me know. Marie, does the Q&A works? Is what I'm seeing. Okay, pop it into the Q&A then. Just let us know who you are, why you're here. Perfect. Let's do it in a Q&A. Sorry, it's a webinar and I'm not as used to webinars. Thanks so much. We are talking about decriminalization today, so I do just want to put it out there that this could trigger an emotional response in you. That is a real possibility. So if you are feeling that you're triggered in anything that we're saying or talking about today, I do encourage you to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. If that means stepping away from this webinar, connecting with someone you know and trust, please do so. The Distress Center is also available to help folks if they need to. The number there, 403-266-4357. We are recording this webinar as well. So if you do need to walk away, but you still want to know what gets covered later, you can come back to it at our website. All right, so in the Q&A, who's here? I'm seeing SafeLink. Love you all for attending. We have Cups here. Thank you so much, Cups. Aware is on the line. Amazing. Students from MRU, Love it all. Thank you all for being here. Anyone else, you can hit your send now into that Q&A if you want to just share who you are and why you're here. We have folks wanting to learn new information, understanding why decriminalization is a viable model for us, what that might look like, wanting to learn more, wanting to be able to support the advocacy work, listen and learn. So thank you all so much for being here and for joining us. What are we going to cover in the next 45 to 50 minutes? We're going to talk briefly about Canada's prohibition, what that looks like, what that has looked like historically. Kevin's then going to get into Bill C-216, talk about the decriminalization models locally, internationally, what we see working. We're going to talk a little bit about safer supply as part of that. And then we're going to open up for some Q&As with our panelists from Mom Stop the Harm. Before we do move on, though, I do want to take a moment of silence to remember those who we've lost in this battle to toxic drugs, and their memories are not, I don't want their memories to be in vain for the advocacy work that we do, but they are loved, they are valued, and I want to take a moment to honor them. Thank you. So Canadian prohibition. Let's talk about why substances are currently illegal in Canada. And if you're not familiar with prohibition, it is not rooted in public health. It is actually rooted in racism, and that can be pretty clearly tracked when we start to look at when laws came in and what laws came in. I would say Canada's drug prohibition was traditionally rooted in racism as a way to suppress certain minority groups, and it continues to be a way that we see racism being played out in the Canadian system. So prior to the 1800s, really prohibition of substances didn't exist. What we saw before the 1900s was that many of the substances, which are now considered illegal or illicit, they were used medicinally in a lot of different ways. They were used in ceremony in a lot of different ways, and it was up to individuals to govern them. We really didn't see these concepts of prohibition come in until the temperance movement in the early 1900s. So the temperance movement was really focused around alcohol prohibition and putting some legislation in that. This really started, the temperance movement started in the US, and then it spread to Nordic countries and the English-speaking countries of Europe and the British colonies. So by the late 1890s, early 1900s, Canada saw its first temperance groups start to pop up in Nova Scotia and in Montreal. And really the driving factors for alcohol prohibition was morality. So during the Middle Ages, drunken behavior was deemed as a sin, and it was actually less due to inebriation, but more because it was considered overindulgent and therefore constituted the sin of gluttony. Throughout the 1800s, we started to see a lot of adaptation of that prohibition mindset kind of spread across Canada. So prohibition really started at a local community level, and then it moved to more provincial and national levels throughout the early 19th century. In addition to it really being influenced by the church and the rise of Christianity in Canada, alcohol prohibition was also influenced by the regulation of womanhood. So maternal feminists really claimed that their rights and their privileges as women was due in part to their capacity to reproduce. Drinking could damage a woman's body and their reproductive organs, and therefore actually damage the overall health of the nation. So those groups are really fighting for prohibition and to stop it due to procreation. We also saw at this time, though, an arrival of a large amount of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, and there's a lot of cultural differences which created xenophobia. And the threat of foreign newcomers and the way that they used alcohol threatened the settlers who were already here, and they started to try to put in more regulations around it. In the late 1800s, the Scots Temperance Act was federal legislation which allowed local government authorities to create their own bylaws surrounding alcohol prohibition. And PEI was actually the first province to provincially enforce prohibition in 1901. Between 1915 and 1916, all of the provinces but Quebec had prohibited alcohol sales to some capacity, but by 1920, most of those provincial laws were repealed. The Scots Temperance Act gave local authorities the capacity to create their own bylaws and make their own decisions. But there was one piece of federal legislation that was created at the same time, which also prohibited alcohol. That federal piece of legislation prohibited alcohol to one very specific group of people, and that was through the Indian Act. So the Indian Act, which is a horrifically racist piece of legislation, officially began in 1876. And the original intent behind the prohibition of alcohol for Indigenous folks was rooted in the belief that alcohol would prevent them from being diligent farm laborers. In 1884, the Indian Act was amended, making it a felony for Indigenous people to purchase, consume, or enter any establishment which served alcohol. And that law also applied to anyone caught selling alcohol to Indigenous folks. That section of the Indian Act related to alcohol in that community was not repealed until 1985. That remained on the books. After alcohol prohibition changed, so we continued to see the federal law specifically towards the Indigenous community, but we didn't see other laws around substances or other communities really come in until 1908, and that was the Opium Act. It was the first piece of legislation around substances that were not alcohol related. So prior to the Opium Act, again, really few restrictions around substances, around opium use. Cigarette smoking and alcohol were really considered to be a much greater threat to public health and social morals than opium itself. But there was a driving factor behind the Opium Act, and that was actually thought to be focused less on public health and more against Chinese opium smokers and the Chinese opium industry. The social concern was not about the physical harms that could be associated with opium, but actually about interracial fraternization of white opium smokers with the Chinese community. So for folks who may not be as familiar with Canadian history, what we saw is when Canada started to be building itself as a nation on this land, we started to build a railway to go from sea to sea. So we brought in a tremendous amount of Asian immigrants to exploit their labor to build the railway. When the railway work ended, at the beginning of the century, unemployment rates within the Chinese community started to rise. And what we saw was a resentment from the white population towards the Chinese community because they were no longer employed. So we had a large amount of individuals who we brought in to exploit their labor, then they were no longer employed and we were providing social assistance to them. This provided a lot of ammunition and anti-Asian racism and hate towards the community due to increase in taxes around it. On September 7th, 1907, thousands of people rallied in front of Vancouver City Hall to protest against Asian immigration to Canada. This is what was called the race riots. So the Prime Minister at that time, Wilfrid Laurier, sent the Deputy Minister of Labour, Mackenzie King, over to Vancouver to try to appease those protesters. Mackenzie King was also trying to really he had a lot of white supremacy ideals and was really trying to stop that immigration as well and suppress racialized minorities. So he used that as an opportunity to really spearhead this regulations against the opium industry to further suppress the Chinese community and help make a stand as a Christian nation against opium use. So in 1908, the Opium Act was first imposed, and it imposed criminal punishment on certain substances in Canada, specifically opium. It started as minor offenses and then eventually moved into imprisonment. The Opium Act was amended in 1911 to include other substances like morphine and cocaine. And in 1923, it was expanded even further to include cannabis. So here's a quote from Mackenzie King, which further just enforces the racist notions that I'm speaking about here. So talking about the Chinese with whom Mackenzie King had conversed with on the subject assured him that almost as much opium was sold to the white people as the Chinese. To be indifferent to the growth of such evil in Canada would be inconsistent with the principles of morality, which ought to govern the nation, the Christian nation. So there's hints there of the interracial fraternization, as well as that moral stance that politicians were really trying, the moral Christian stance that politicians were trying to build the country on. It continues from there. I don't have time to break down how it continues to be problematic, but what we do know right now is that even in Canada's prison systems, incarceration rates for racialized minorities are absolutely significantly higher than their white counterparts for substance-related offenses. And we know that many individuals from racialized communities are actually still serving time for cannabis-related offenses, even though cannabis was decriminalized a few years back. So Kevin, now that I've laid that foundation, tell us what the future could look like.
Sure. If I can read my notes. Yeah, so a few years ago, if you can, yeah, a few private members of Parliament asked the Canadian government to treat substance use and addiction as a public health issue rather than a criminal one, which it has always kind of been seen as. So this created Bill C-216, which recommended to amend the current Controlled Drugs and Substances Act to engage the expungement of certain drug-related conviction acts and the National Strategy on Substance Use Act. I'll explain what that means in a minute. So the first reading in the House of Commons was in December of 2021. But the second reading in June 2022, the reading was shut down, and now unfortunately it's dead in the water. If we can move to the next slide. So the big thing with BC-216 is the decriminalization of personal drug possession. We should just let you know that decriminalization isn't a new concept in Canada. In the late 60s, the Canadian government commissioned a new inquiry into recreational drug use. So the findings recommended that the criminal sanctions be reduced for cannabis possession and medical treatment for those who are using opioids, and that they not be criminally punished. So it's been of course, that was never implemented, obviously, and it's kind of been a battle ever since. So the Bill C-216 comprises of three parts. So the decriminalization of possession of small amounts of illicit substances intended for personal use. So this calls to repeal sanctions 4 and 4.1 of the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act. And the rationale for this is people who fear being criminalized for personal use, they hesitate to seek help because they fear being arrested, and it'll remove the barriers for accessing services without repealing the laws govern, like for commercial and or the sale of criminalized substances. The second, sorry, I'm saying a lot. The second part would be the expungement of criminal records of all Canadians related to simple possession convictions. So this would be the establishment of a new expungement of certain drug-related convictions act. The act would provide Canadians with opportunity to have their criminal records cleared if their charges were for simple possession. The rationale behind this act is to allow those convicted for simple possession to live their lives free of burden of that criminal record. Finally, is to establish a new strategy on Substance Use Act. This is an introduction of a health-based approach to the Substance Use Act and promotion of more comprehensive health approaches. I just got all mixed up here, sorry. So this strategy would include evidence-based practices that address the root causes of substance use, low barrier access to safer supply of medically regulated substances, and universal access to recovery, treatment, and harm reduction services, which would include overdose prevention services, relapse prevention services, SCS, so supervised consumption services. Yeah, I think we can move. Okay.
For this bill, that national strategy also was designed and have been advocating to include consultations with people with lived or lived experience of substance use and the advocates that support them. So nothing about us without us principles continuing to be applied. For building legislation that impacts community. Let's chat with community about what they want and implement their voices as well.
So now we'll just actually talk about what decriminalization, why it's important. So I think, you know, for a lot of people, when they think of decriminalization, they think of the Portugal model. The Portugal model is a great first step, but it's not without its issues, just like anything. So a little background: the Portugal model was introduced in 2001 as a response to a public health crisis. In the late 90s, Portugal was faced with the highest rates of substance-related HIV in the European Union, and second highest rate of HIV among injection drug users. And on top of that, the accidental drug poisoning rates were increasing rapidly, like many other parts of the world. So some pros to the Portugal model would be there has been accidental drug poisonings have decreased by 80%. The prevalence rate of new HIV diagnosis among people who use drugs has decreased by 46%. Incarcerations due to the drug-related offenses decreased by 40%. And between 1998 and 2011, people accessing treatment increased by 60%. I mean, these are these are stats, and it's the science of it, and it works. But there are some issues with how Portugal does run it. So they basically give you two options. You'll get a large fine and they send you to treatment, or you face prison time. The issue with this is that this is why their treatment, like their people accessing treatment has gone up by 60%, but that's because it's either that or go to jail. So there is an issue with that, sending people to jail to treatment without them being ready. I'll get into that a little bit here. So anything over a small possession is considered criminal still. So if you have over whatever their threshold is, you're still going to jail. Treatment isn't for everybody, and the black market still remains strong because they're not regulating the substances. All they're doing is decriminalizing. And so unless you actually regulate the substance, there's no reason that the black market would go away. Right, go to the next slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about, sorry, I'm losing my voice. There are a lot of countries in the world that actually they have adopted decriminalization policies in one way or another. That being said, they all have significant differences and levels of effectiveness, and the implementation of drug policy reforms is still quite. The countries are still quite reluctant. So some examples would be so some countries their level of decriminalization is actually determined by the police that would show up on the scene or that would catch you with drugs. So there's some obvious issues with that. it leaves the police and the person holding the drugs, without knowing exactly what the rule is. For many nations, some drugs are decriminalized and others aren't. And these thresholds of decriminalized drugs, they vary so much that it creates this confusion between the policy enforcers and the users. Countries like Canada, there's no consistency. So it varies, like each rule varies greatly between province to province, which it can cause obvious issues. And then there's the threshold amounts. Some countries that are decriminalized, their thresholds are just unreasonable. I know an example would be the Netherlands. So with the exception of cannabis, all drugs are decriminalized except with a threshold of 0.5 grams, which is very little. Like that's, and so the big issue with this is with having such a low threshold is it's still forcing people to go back to the streets and to the black market every day to find more drugs, or several times a day to find more drugs. It's not really, it's preventing somebody maybe from going to jail for an afternoon or something, but it's not preventing looking at the big picture. So that's a real issue, and there's a lot of countries that have these low thresholds. I think it's important to talk a little bit. I don't want to get into this very much just because I can get heated a little bit about it too. And I know myself. So is the UCP proposed Compassionate Intervention Act. So if this legislation is passed, which would be if they get voted in again, so who knows, law enforcement, family members, or legal guardians of people who use drugs will be able to refer adults or youth into involuntary treatment if they see themselves as a risk. If they deem there's a risk to themselves or to others. So involuntary treatment can be a dangerous thing. It's not evidence-based. It's not an evidence-based intervention by any means, and a person needs to be ready. And this whole involuntary treatment, it's a breach to human rights. It's creating additional stigma, discrimination. Involuntary treatment creates a greater risk of drug poisoning for when the person exits because their tolerance is lower, and they're not going to take the same. They're not going to take the treatment in the same as somebody who is ready for treatment. It gives the person who is using the drugs, or it makes them feel like they're doing something wrong, and that's something we really need to address, because using substances is not wrong, right? It's not. And the big thing is it's paternalistic. So they'll still be, if the person is found using drugs, they'll have to go to what they're going to call an intervention commission, which is basically just a court. And this gives the user access to several services, which is wonderful and can be positive. However, this is that paternalistic approach I was talking about. It's the courts telling people what is good for them and what they need in that moment. And then we'll talk a little bit about what safer supply is. So, I mean, with the addition of community-based naloxone, supervised consumption services, opioid agonist therapies, these are all wonderful steps forward. But unfortunately, Canadians who use drugs are continuing to die. And so additional and innovative techniques, they need to be developed by governments and healthcare providers to slow this current death rate rate of death or whatever. So one approach is safer supply, and there's basically two ways we could do this. There's one where doctors prescribed pharmaceuticals that are similar to what the individual is using. So that could be Dilaudid for fentanyl or whatever. The problem here is that a lot of the time the prescribed substance is it's weaker than what's on the streets. So that'll be an issue that needs to be addressed. Or there's just regulating all criminal substances and selling them in a store like a cannabis store. And so this would basically just be the legalization of substances. So what safer supply is it's evidence-based. It mitigates toxic supply, it reduces stigma, it improves the overall quality of life of those who use drugs and their loved ones. It's aligned with the Canadian Human Rights Act, and it's common sense to a lot of people. And what it is not, it does not enable drug use. It doesn't intensify the drug poisoning emergency. It actually would do the opposite, because it's people they know what they're putting into their body rather than looking for meth and coming out with fentanyl, right? So there's that. It doesn't make doctors drug dealers. It's doctors helping people, and it doesn't waste tax dollars, as it is proven to lessen the ER visits, overdoses, everything like that. Yeah, I'll go to the next slide. Thank you. And then these are just some stats from a place in London, Ontario. So the London Inter-Community Health Center, between I think 2020 and end of 2021, they had a program called the Safer Opioid Supply Program. So people at the end of the program, 59% of the participants saw improvement in their physical health, and 35% no longer injected their drugs. Drug toxicity events dropped from 59% to 23%. ER visits went from 77% to 45%. And contact with police went from 73 to 37%. And I mean, you can read the rest. It's just what this proves is that safer supply, it addresses a lot of different parts to the dangers of substance use, and it's just important, and it makes sense. So, all right, I did it as fast as I could.
We spent some time taking just looking at the history on drug prohibition not really being rooted in public health, but more as a targeted approach around certain communities, and then unpacking what's working, what's not working, the pros and cons of those models that are out there, and then the science and the data that we can find around safer supply and decrim and what that might look like. But let's take it away from the research and let's make it a little bit more personal there. And that's why we had asked Kim and Sarah from Mom Stop the Harm to come and join us today. So thank you both for being here. I will do a very quick introduction, as I know you both provided us some bios. So Kim Porter is a retired educator who left the profession soon after her son died from the toxic drug supply. She now belongs to various groups in Medicine Hat advocating for drug policy change. And Sarah is a citizen of the Miscue Cree First Nation from Fort Chipewyan in Alberta, where her father's family resides, and her mother's family is Métis from Lac Saint Anne in Alberta. She's a PhD candidate in the education policy studies with a specialization in Indigenous peoples education, and her doctoral research examines Indigenous art as a pedagogy. She holds a master's in educational policy studies and a BA in Native Studies. And she works on a project right now, which was fascinating when she told me about it, as a coordinator in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. Sarah's also a bereaved mother who became a member of Mom Stop the Harm after her son tragically passed away due to the drug toxicity crisis in December of last year. So thank you both for joining us today. One of the questions that came in while Kevin was speaking that I think both of you might have some knowledge to share on is, why are we talking decriminalization over legislation? And what might the differences be?
I'll speak first, Sarah. So when after my son died and I felt I needed to educate myself deeper, I needed to find out what is the difference between decrim and legalization. And in my experience and my learning, we need both. We need substances for personal use to be decriminalized. We also need the market of drug supplies to be legalized, therefore regulated, so that people using the substances know what they're getting. Like if you were to go to the beer store to buy a beer, you would know the percentage of alcohol in it, you would know that it's not tainted. And so that's because it's been legalized and regulated, and we need to do the same with the drugs that people wish to use.
No. I learned something there too. I will say in advance that I'm very, very new to this whole conversation. My son just passed away 4 months ago. So I just wanted to, I guess, provide well, I can't think of the word, but I'm very much a baby harm reductionist, and I don't really know a lot of the ins and outs of some of these issues. So, I mean, before my son passed away, I was full on, you need to go to treatment, like treatment and full recovery and abstinence is going to be the only way forward with my son. And his death has, I guess, opened my eyes in a way. Right. So yeah, I'll just as a statement, there are things that I honestly cannot talk about because I'm still learning myself. But I agree with Kim completely.
Yeah. And you know, Sarah, I love that. I love your authenticity and honesty around that. But I think it also shows that we don't all know all the things, and just we can also move in what feels right in our hearts, what feels right in our souls when we start to connect with some ideas. And sometimes even when we're doing our advocacy, we don't have to have all the answers. We need heart and passion for change. And I love that you're here, Sarah. So we will open Q&A up to anyone on the call who might have a question around any of these topics for Kim or Sarah or Kevin or myself. But one question I will bring up as well is, as two moms who have been directly impacted by the current drug toxicity crisis in Canada, and for folks who do not know, we are now losing one person every 49 minutes in this country due to the drug toxicity crisis and the tainted drug supply. That is outrageous, and that is not acceptable. And change needs to happen. But what does decriminalization of people who use substances mean to you both on a personal level?
Well, to me, it means we're speaking the truth, that people use drugs, and people have used drugs for 2,000 or so years, and they're going to continue to use drugs. So that's the first thing that speaks to me, is that we're acknowledging this. I believe that, of course, it will lead to less stigma, more accepted that this is a way of life for many people. I think it might lead to less fear of authority. I actually believe it will save money for the system. And though the money that's saved can be better used to help in the area of mental health in one area. I also think it speaks, as you said, to the heart. It speaks about our empathy, our compassion for humanity.
Yeah, yeah. What about you, Sarah? What changes do you think it could? What changes do you think it could make?
It will stop putting in people in jail for doing something that feels good to them, for many reasons. I mean, I shared this story when I spoke with you, Kevin, a couple of days ago, about how my son had his first arrest was in 2015 when he was 24 years old. It was not drug related, but it was his first arrest. And after that, he cycled in and out of remand and jail for about 5 years until 2020. He never ended up in the federal system, but he was kind of in and out. And from 2020 to when he passed in December, he didn't go back. So he was pretty stable for that period of time. And my son has always struggled with alcohol use from the time he was very young. I think he started to drink when he was 13 or 14 years old. It became more problematic in his 20s. But he had, of course, tried other substances too. I know that that's a fact. But it was going to jail and going to remand where his substance use really took hold. Like if we are imagining that taking people off of the streets for drug use or for drug possession and putting them in prisons or jails or remand is going to fix some kind of problem, like just getting them off the streets and prison is this magical place where they're not going to use drugs anymore. That doesn't happen. We know that there is significant drug use inside. So when he came out, it really kind of, that his time inside really ramped up his use, particularly around drugs and alcohol for that matter. I mean, that whole experience for him was the experience of jail, further entrenched, I guess, his feelings of worthlessness, his feelings of of worthlessness and not being good enough, which fueled his substance use. That was for me, I think, for him, I think, was at the heart of it, was that he just didn't think he was a worthy person. So putting people in jail because of their drug use just further stigmatizes and creates more of an issue for them than if they hadn't gone to jail, I guess. So that's kind of where I'm standing. Like, if you don't put people in jail for drug use, if you decriminalize at bare minimum, then you're not further traumatizing them.
Yeah. So this is a question that, sorry, go ahead, Kim.
I was just going to add to the word shame that's so entrenched in drug use, and that I think in the long run was probably what killed my son. Was he had booked an appointment for me to come to see his psychiatrist with him. The appointment was 7 days after he died, and I don't talk about this very much because, of course, I don't know the truth of it. But his his psychiatrist kept that appointment with us after Neil died, and he thought Neil's death was a death of suicide. And he thought that Neil knew what he was doing at that point because of the messages that he was getting from our society about who he was as a human being. And so a baby step in decriminalizing it can help take away some of that shame.
Yeah, the stigma that kills with it. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I'll let Kim, I'll ask you this question first, Sarah. If you want to add anything, please do. But Kevin, you might have some knowledge around this as well. When we talk about decriminalizing, especially within the safer supply piece, one of the questions that's come in is, do we feel that making all of these supplies that are currently considered illicit readily available to the public, do we think that could be a threat to public health, cause harm in any capacity, or that we might actually see an increase in some of these substance use for individuals who are just curious? And could that cause harm?
Oh, in what's happened in Portugal, it didn't cause harm. The age group of kids, what is it, 15 to 24, that are most at risk for developing substance dependency, that dropped. I think that's it goes back to, well, if we teach kids about how to use a nasal naloxone kit, or if we give kids condoms, we're saying it's okay. And no one's promoting that someone get into a situation where they're going to struggle with their substances. Nobody asked for that. So that's part of where we have to change hearts and minds, is just by decriminalizing it isn't going to mean that more people are going to use it. And we can say that, but there's been studies that have proven that.
Yeah.
I think as far as even legalizing, and I think that's I think the bottom line is people are curious, you know, and whether they try something or not, I mean, that's on them. I don't think legalizing the substance is gonna, you know, make people start running to the store buying heroin or whatever. But if they do, like I said, the bottom line here is, I would rather them try something that's regulated than them go to the street and try something that's not. And I think I just, you know, and I think it's that easy, and it's that simple, you know. It's going to happen regardless. If you want to try a substance, you're going to try it, right? So I just, yeah, I don't know. That's where the common sense piece comes in for me.
Yeah, another part of that common sense piece is when safer supply, and people are saying, well, people are selling it, and that's a concern. And there isn't a concern, because then the people that are buying it know they're getting a safe supply. So if someone's going to experiment, like you said, Ken, wouldn't you rather it be with a safer supply?
One of the things that I really liked about the bill that was proposed, which unfortunately was shut down in the second reading, is it's not a singular bill. It's not just saying decrim. It's not just saying the personal possession. It's not just saying anti-stigma campaigns. It's not just saying safer supply. It's not saying harm reduction, equality across the country. It's actually asking for all of those, which I think really matter when we talk about an effective model as well, because it does create more systems and pathways for care, support, connection, which I think would further the kind of further what both Kim and Kevin have said there, as well as it gives that safer supply. But for folks who maybe are experiencing trauma, or those reasons that could cause them to be using supplies in a way that is numbing pain, those more additional opportunities to connect, to get support, to be in relationship are also being built out of what that decriminalization bill is asking for, which I think is a really beautiful, holistic approach. Just looking at some more, there's more comments coming into the chat box right now, but really mentioning that drug and alcohol addiction is really a symptom of unhealed or untreated trauma. And until we're able to maybe get to some of those root pieces of those hurts, things like treatment is a Band-Aid solution, and we need plans beyond treatment. We need connection beyond treatment to help with healing and support. So thank you for those comments there.
Gabor Mate believes that addiction, whether it's addiction to a substance or to sex or to shopping, he believes it's an adaptation to the past trauma that we've dealt with. And so it's perhaps not a healthy adaptation, but that's how we're trying to save ourselves.
Is there anything from either of your two perspectives that bill that did get shut down was missing? Was there anything you'd add if you were personally in charge of all the bill writing and that legislative piece?
Yeah, I put some notes down. Sarah, do you want me to start?
Please.
So one of the things I thought was the threshold was too low. And so it needed to be increased. The lower the threshold, the less lives that are going to be saved. So when Kevin talked about, I think a 0.5 gram, I think in BC it's 2 grams. And that's for some people that use carries, then they're going to, that doesn't even cover it. Another things that they could have talked about was, what do you do if you come across someone that's dealing drugs, but not because, but the reason why they're dealing them is for their own subsistence. So they need to deal those drugs in order to get drugs for their own needs. That needed to be considered in the bill. And they also didn't talk about the black market for cannabis. If you get caught with black market cannabis, are you going to be charged or not charged? And my belief is that you shouldn't be charged, whether it's black market or you bought it in a store. And the one thing is they call this a crisis, but it's not being treated like a crisis. And so that term, either don't use that term or use it and then act on it, and put emergency measures in place.
Absolutely. Sarah, did you have any ideas that you wanted to add to that as well?
In terms of what's missing?
Yeah.
Well, one of the points was that to implement evidence-based prevention programs that address social and economic factors that contribute to problematic substance use. And maybe it's beyond the scope of the act to actually name some of these things that could be taken on, such as a universal basic income, because if someone has universal basic income, maybe they don't have to sell, they don't have to be street level dealers, right? They don't have to do that to supply their own use, right? Or housing for all. I mean, I would like to see these kinds of things named in national legislation, in national public policy as points of harm reduction. The reason my son did so well and didn't commit any more crimes from 2020 to almost 3 years is because he had a place to live. Like, he had his own place to live. He was autonomous that way. And I spent a lot of money personally making sure that he had his own place, that he could feel autonomous. And he had a space where he could just do what he needed to do. So he wasn't out on the streets. He wasn't, committing he wasn't doing all of these things, right? He had housing, and he had food, and he had what he needed to survive. He lost his apartment in October of last year, and he lost his apartment in October of last year, and then he was on employment insurance until his last pay from the employment insurance was 3 days before he passed.
Mm.
So, I mean, I can't say what was in his head at that time, or what was, what was going on really. But to me, it felt like, looking, from mom's side, he felt he had no options. He had no income and no house and no place to live. And did not like the shame and stigma of living on the street.
Yeah.
Like, that was too much for him. Yeah, so like I said, maybe those things can't be addressed in this act, but there needs to be a bigger conversation about those points of those social determinants of health that are going to keep our kids alive. Like addressing those, I believe, would help keep our kids alive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Last question, just being mindful of time. The folks that are on this call obviously are here. They're curious about this topic. I know many who are on the call are advocates for change, but from both of your perspectives, how can engaged community members really support this advocacy work? What are some options that we have to help facilitate this level of change on an individual level?
In my experience, I try to surround myself with people who speak the same language. I don't bother anymore having very deep discussions with those who refuse to open up their hearts and mind. That's a terrible waste of my energy. And I'm learning to not take the comments that I receive as a mother personally. And I also believe that that when I need a break, I take a break and I don't quit. And I keep screaming.
Yeah. Sarah, what about you?
Just based on where I'm personally at in this moment, there is, and like I said earlier, I have still so much to learn. There's so much I need to learn. But I'm also realizing that I'm starting to get overwhelmed by everything that needs to be done, everything that needs to happen.
Yeah.
All of the different kind of things that I think are necessary and important in this advocacy. I guess I'm realizing I can't do it all. And I think that's important in any kind of advocacy work, is to recognize that you can't do it all. So a lot of my work, like my actual work and my educational work, is around prison art and prison education. So that ties in for me in this in my advocacy work too. So what am I trying to say? That I'm trying to find the place where I fit best. Like, is it coming to these kinds of public discussions and sharing my story? I'm not sure yet. Is it taking up the issues of prisons and police and pouring all of my work there? Is it taking up the right to housing and universal basic income? They are all tied together. And in my mind, I'm probably working on all of them at different times and levels. But I kind of feel at this point like I need to focus on something because I'm becoming overwhelmed and overburdened
Yeah.
in a way that's going to that's not going to be sustainable. So I think that's really important in any kind of advocacy work, is you just find where your heart is. Where's your heart? Like what speaks the most to you about in whatever kind of advocacy you're doing.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think just synthesizing what both you and Kim said, self-care is a form of advocacy, and finding your spot too. I know I'm an introvert. Mass protests make me very uncomfortable. But finding that spot where you can go, it's giving you energy, but also knowing when you can step back. And housing, basic needs, universal income, mental health supports, trauma support, all of that is part of this bigger picture as well. So I think it's people can find their spaces. Just being mindful of time, we are at noon. Thank you both so much for coming, sharing your stories, sharing your experiences, your ideas with us, and teaching us that we can kind of all start whenever. And that's a really beautiful place to be as well. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you everyone on the call who joined us. I will be sending out a survey to get your feedback, and we will be making this available on our website as well. So thank you so much everyone, and have an excellent day.
Thank you.
Thank you.